Hey guys, and this time we're exploring deontology rather than what we call consequentialism, which means we're going to be looking at an ethical theory that argues it's what you do that determines what's right or wrong, not necessarily the consequences of it. So our overall goal is we're going to define what deontology is, and we're going to explore Kant's version of deontology, which is outlined in what we call the categorical imperative. So can you write that down? And a little word of warning, this is where the theory gets really intense. So you really need to concentrate this time, okay? Now, you're very good at setting goals for yourself, so I would like you to tell me, if this is the overall big goal that we want to achieve, what do you actually have to do? What's a goal you need to achieve in classroom in order to get you to recap about what you already know about ethics? Can you write it down for me? Then, can you write down another success criteria or a small goal that you need to achieve in order to be able to learn new words, new terms? Once you've done that, would you then go through the process of outlining how you put all these key terms together and everything you previously knew in order to show that you understand a new theory? What do you need to do to understand a new theory? Can you just outline that? Now, if you're stuck, just write down what you think you're going to do in class to do it. So to recap, are you going to go over your previous notes? Are you going to talk to a friend to try and talk about everything you know about ethics? Again, when it comes to learning new terms and learning vocabulary, what have we done in the classroom before? What do you usually do in order to learn new terms? And then to understand a big theory, not just key words, but how will the words interrelate and work together? What do you do? How do you go ahead and make sure that you understand a key term, understand a whole theory as opposed to one idea of that theory? So can you write down 3 success criteria, each one based on one of the skills that I've outlined here? And then, can you do me a favour, pretty please with the cherry on top, and go ahead and score yourself in each of the success criteria that you wrote. Once you've done that, I need you to do an APK, and I would like you to draw a picture of somebody doing something wrong based on their action, not the consequences, okay? So can you just draw a picture of somebody doing something wrong based on the action, not the consequences? That's it. All right. So remember last video we talked about utilitarianism being an example of what we call consequentialist ethics. And consequentialist ethics says what is right or wrong, it's not based on the action, but it's the consequences of the action itself. So if the action produces a higher amount of pleasure and reduces the pain, then the consequences of the pleasure and pain produced decide whether or not the decision is the right decision to make. But there's also a kind of other ethics which we call deontological. And deontological ethics is when we say actually murder or an action in and of itself is just wrong. You can never justify it. Now, in many cases, you'll find that people use different forms of ethics. But I'd like you to turn around to the person next to you and just have a discussion about what type of ethics suits you the best. I use more to side with consequentialist ethics and deontological ethics. Can you do that for me? Alright, I should probably tell you now that I am erring on the side of deontological ethics. I'm never going to push somebody into a position. I'm just going to declare my biases, and then hopefully you're going to be strong enough to come along and say, hey, actually, sir, this is wrong, that's right. I see that you're biased, and I'm going to be critical of it. Okay, sometimes teachers can get into a habit of declaring that they're impartial, and they kind of unconsciously let their bias shine through, and they don't present the information correctly. Sometimes I think declaring your bias is the best thing to do. So let's get into some really complex subjects straight away. If you were to ask this question, what is God? you would get some pretty complex answers. Most of you would think he's a man in the sky looking down on us and saying, this is wrong, that's right. But from a Kant's point of view, and he's the guy that we're talking about the most, not a Kant, but from Kant's point of view, God is what we call a necessary being. And that's really, really important, because for him, God isn't in space or time. For him, God is an intelligent force, an intelligent being that exists outside of space and time, as an idea almost, but not really an idea, but as a being that just doesn't have a spatial or temporal existence. Spatial meaning space and temporal meaning time. And if you're a bit confused about what that would be like, well, think about the idea of a perfect circle, not the drawing of it, but the idea of a perfect circle. And we can definitively, well, not definitively, but most of us would agree that outside of space or time, across all space, a circle's diameter, when divided by, a circle's circumference, when divided by its diameter, will always equal 3.14. And if we were to go into imaginary universes or other possible universes, a circle could never change that relationship. In fact, that relationship is always necessary, okay? And because that relationship is necessary and it transcends space and time, it is an object of necessity. So can you write down a note which basically records what a necessary being is? It's a being or a thing that that exists outside of space and time and has a necessary logic to it. All right. So other examples of necessary objects would be maths, 1 + 1 equaling 2. Or other necessary objects would be geometry again, or triangles have 3 sides and 180 degrees within them. And the key thing about necessary objects, and you probably want to take a note about this, is that you don't need to observe them in space and time in order to corroborate their truth. 1 + 1 is 2 because it just is, not because you observed 1 + 1 equaling 2 when you went for a walk down to the park, okay? So take a note. Now, the key thing to understanding Immanuel Kant's theory is that he believed that the mind was capable of performing this kind of necessary logic. And another way we refer to necessary logic is we say it's deductive. All right, it's a logic which is about these necessary things, like 1 + 1 equaling 2. It's a deductive logic, okay? Take a note. And so when a person thinks about these necessary beings, they're actually performing deductive logic. And he honestly believed that morality has a deductive kind of logic to it. In other words, morality can help us find laws that are like a circle. Laws that are just true no matter what, outside of time and space, and they have the same kind of logical validity as 1 + 1 equaling 2, or as the fact that in an ideal world, parallel lines never meet, okay, or a circle can never have a straight edge. He honestly believed that that's what moral logic is like. Moral logic is necessary logic. It has necessity. And God created moral logic and all other necessary objects. Take a note. So moral logic, according to Kant, is about logic. It's about setting some laws out of that logic, and it's about universality. It all creates this kind of idea of morality, okay? So he was what we call a deontologist, and a deontology is, like we said before, an ethical system that argues that the actions determine what is right or wrong, and its opposite is consequentialism, which is an ethics that argues that right or wrong is based on consequences. You probably want to recall that difference. Now, to kind of get what a categorical imperative is, we need to explore this idea of contingency. Now, contingent things, and I don't kind of expect you to fully understand what I'm talking about now, But contingent things are things that are observed in time and space, and they're observed through associations. Take a note. Alright, so if I was to punch your next door neighbour in the face, your next door neighbour would cry, most likely. But the only way I could know that is because I've experienced it over time in space. Unlike knowing that a circle has a particular ratio when I divide its circumference by a diameter, it'll always equal 3.14. That never needed to be observed in time and space to know it. But to know that someone's going to cry when you punch them in the face is something that you need to observe in experience. And because it is in time and space, we can't observe every single instant of when we punch someone in the face. So, because we can't do that, we can't know 100% for sure that when we punch someone in the face, they're going to cry. We can only have a probable or a probability estimate of it. We can say we're 99% sure that that's usually what happens. So contingent phenomena, or anything that is contingent, is really about chance. It's about probability, right? And it's based on seeing how one thing makes another thing happen, so cause and effect, or one thing happens when another thing happens, so association. Take a note. Right, so that's pretty deep. And what Kant noticed was there's certain moral statements or moral things you can do that have a contingent reasoning to them. And he called these things hypothetical imperatives. Now, anything that's hypothetical is imagined in the future, but it's still imagined in time or space. And an imperative is like a call to action. It's a duty or a requirement, right? And he said when you have hypothetical imperatives, you have an action that's always justified by a reason, but you find the action and the justification in space and time. They just don't have their own kind of outside of time and space proof to it. An example of that would be, if I help a lady cross the road, I'm going to feel good about myself. And when I do that, right, I can see that there's a relationship between feeling good about myself and helping the lady cross the road. But, and this is the key thing, right, I can't be 100% sure that that's always going to be the case, because I haven't observed every single instance of when I'm going to help a lady cross the road or when other people have. So again, it's an assertion of probability. Really, a person should say, if I help this lady across the road, I will feel good about myself, probably. Okay? What I'd like you to do is pause the video and just write down 5 kind of justifications you would give for something being right or wrong, and what it is basically that you would do that is right or wrong. Like, do I help my sister with her homework because it makes my mum happy? You get what I mean? 5 general statements about hypothetical imperatives where there's an action and you've justified why you thought that it was actually the right thing to do. Okay? Alright, this is where we get really, really, really deep. And I can't help it. I just have to get into this level of depth with you. So, if you haven't done so and your brain's a little fried, I just want you to turn around and tell the person next to you what you plan on watching on Netflix on the weekend, or just have a bit of a chat about something different, and then come back to the video, okay? Alright. Hypothetical imperatives are contingent. Contingent phenomena involve something really, really strange. That is that the subject performing the action, right, don't imply each other. And that will be really obvious when I explain a case where they do, all right? So a subject of an action is a doer, all right? It's the person who performs an action. A predicate is the actual action itself, and the object receives the action. So in this case, I am walking the old lady across the road. I am the subject, walking is the action, or the predicate, and the old lady is the object. Okay, take a note. Now, there's nothing about me that implies the action of walking. And when that's the case, we know that what we're observing is contingent. Now, you might be thinking, oh, what? I have no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean by a subject implying a predicate? That just doesn't make any sense to me. Well, let's see if I've got an example of it over here. No, I don't. All right, so I'll have to tell you an example. All right, if I am a bachelor, I don't need to say a bachelor is unmarried. To do so is just really silly, all right? If I say a triangle, the idea of a triangle simply implies that it has 180 degrees and 3 straight edges, okay? If I say a circle, it implies the relationship of pi. In this case, an actual action is to be something. So when I am being something, or in other words, when something is something, that is still a predicate. And when I say a circle is round with no straight edges, the word circle actually implies what it is, right? But when I say I am walking the old lady across the street, the I doesn't imply walking, right? When I say he is a bachelor, I'm implying that he is unmarried and is a man, right? But when I hit a tennis ball with a racket, the tennis ball and the racket, they don't imply hitting, okay? That's really key to get. In a contingent relationship, the thing performing the action doesn't imply the action. But in a necessary relationship, the thing performing the action of being something does imply what it is. So if I said I'm an unmarried bachelor, that's just stupid. You just need to say bachelor, because bachelor implies unmarried. Take a note. All right, so in this statement also of me walking the lady across the road, we have what we call subject-object-predicate, and I feel good about myself. This last clause depends on the first clause. If I say I will feel good about myself, something is missing. The statement doesn't make sense by itself. But if I attach it to the first clause, which is if I help this lady across the road, guess what? It makes sense because it depends on the first clause for it to be understood. In a hypothetical imperative, we have contingent relationships between clause 1 and clause 2. That's how it really works. So, if I help this lady across the road, I will feel good about myself. There's nothing about helping the lady cross the road that implies feeling good about myself. And that's the key to understanding what a hypothetical imperative is. The last clause is dependent on the first clause, but the first clause does not imply the second clause. Let me give you another example of a very moral statement. If I donate money to the poor, they will be able to pursue a better education. It's the right thing to do, but pursuing an education and donating money, they don't imply each other. The meaning of both don't imply the meaning of each other. And so when you have a moral action which is justified by a dependent clause that doesn't that isn't implied by the moral action, we call that a hypothetical imperative. Take a note. So at this point, your mind must be really confused. So I'm just going to give you a brief summary of what we have covered when we talk about contingent hypothetical imperatives, all right? Contingent things are things that we observe through associations in time and space. To start off with a small example, if I walk a lady across the road, the I doesn't imply the walking, all right? The two are separate things. But in the opposite, necessary objects, when I talk about a necessary statement or a deductive statement, I could say a circle has round edges and a diameter that when divided by when the circumference is divided by it will equal 3.14, not the diameter. Yeah, when you divide its circumference by its diameter, the ratio will always equal 3.14, right? But if I say circle, I'm just implying that. I don't really need to go through the rest of it because the definition of a circle simply implies all those other things. Whereas here the I doesn't imply that. And in a hypothetical imperative, okay, the actual, in a hypothetical imperative, the first clause doesn't imply the other. In other words, if I help this lady across the road, I will feel good about myself. Feeling good about myself is not implied by helping the lady across the road. I've just observed through time and space that that's highly probable that's the case. So take some notes. Now, remember, I said before that Kant thought that that moral logic was like necessary logic. It had this kind of absolute degree of necessity to it. So he said there must be a different kind of statement, and we're going to call that the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is based on moral statements, and the key thing here is to understand that when we talk about our action, the action should just in and of itself imply that it is correct. Okay? So we don't have this, if I do this, it's right because of this thing. It's just, this is right, and built into it is its justification. Take a note. Okay, so just like a circle implies a circumference and diameter ratio called 3.14, or a triangle implies 180 degrees and 3 sides, or parallel lines never meet, you know, the categorical imperative kind of has to have the same kind of deductive logic. And when you understand that categorical imperatives kind of imply that they're justifications, you'll understand why he really thought the categorical imperative was just one statement that could be said 3 different ways. Take a note. Alright, so how did he go ahead and say these 3 different things? Well, the first thing he thought was, and this is where it gets confusing, was that when you are deciding what is right or wrong, you should always act in a way that others should act in the same situation. And his argument was, you know what, this statement is completely self-contained. The justification is that it's just the right thing to do this. Act in a way that others should act. Okay? And just to, I mean, he didn't really give these things different definitions. He didn't do that. But I do it in class just to make things easy for you to understand. So we're going to call this the principle of universality, right? And again, the justification for performing this is in the action itself. Notice in here I haven't got 2 clauses. I just say act in a way that others should act in the same situation. I haven't said because, I haven't told you why, it's just right in and of itself. So write down the universality principle and make a note about the fact that its justification is self-contained. The second thing is, and I'll get to why these 3 are related in a minute, but I'll just outline what they are now, is the humanity principle, all right? Oh, spelled it wrong, let's change it. Now, the humanity principle is that you should treat others as an end, not a means to an end. In other words, you should not use people. Take a note. Now again, that's fully self-justified. The justification is fully contained within. Another way to talk about it, because we understand what subject, predicate, and object is now, is that we treat others as a subject. We try and look for their humanity first, and we put them first, rather than an object to allow us to achieve happiness. Okay? Take a note. And the last one is the principle of the lawmaker principle, which is basically that the right thing to do, the self-justified action, is to act as if you're setting precedents or examples for how other people should behave that will become law for others. Take a note. Alright, so we have got really complex, and this is a 25-minute video. I'm going to stop this now and just going to get you to go through your video and just write out, just do give me some non-linguistic representations of our key concepts, right? But before we do that, let's just quickly go over our overall goal. Have we defined what deontology is? Yes, we have. We've defined what deontology is, and we've explored the 3 different rephrasings of the one categorical imperative. And I'll explain why it really is the one statement in the next video, okay? Did we recap? Yeah, we did. We looked at consequentialism versus deontology. Have you learnt new terms? Necessity, contingency, deductive, inductive, hypothetical imperative, categorical imperative, subject, predicate, object, cause and effect dependent clauses. All these new terms are really important. And we put them all together, we understand a very key aspect of his theory. And you should, if you understand what we've talked about so far, this statement makes sense. Categorical imperatives are necessary statements or deductive statements which have their justification implied within them. And they are 3 different things, the 3 different versions so far. We've got the universality principle, we've got the humanity principle, and we've got the lawmaker principle. All right, we'll stop there and I'll make another video in a minute, okay? Cheers.